Edvar.
Thank you, Chair. I rise today to speak on C-45, but like Senator Hartling, I will choose to start on a lighter, more celebratory note. Today is March 21st, Nowruz Mubarak in many parts of the world. Today is a very big holiday, and I wish it was here, but that's a matter for another day. I want to thank Senator Dean, who has done such an outstanding job in bringing us so far, and to all the senators who have weighed in on this debate with such fervor and such excellent research. And I hope that all of these questions that have been raised today and will be raised today and tomorrow will be addressed at committee. Like Senator Lankin, I would like to start with history because, like many other things, Canada's relationship with cannabis has not been static. It has evolved over time. As recently as in 2011, the previous government amended the Controlled Drug and Substance Act to bring in sweeping penalties in the form of mandatory minimum sentences. But I'd like to go back actually further back in history to the early years of cannabis legalization and the groundwork of prohibition that was laid in the 1920s. And to a large extent, it was based on misinformation, mythology, and simply wrong facts, as for instance, the Los Angeles police chief said, and he was not challenged. He noted that addicts to this drug, while under its influence, become raving maniacs and are liable to kill or indulge in any form of violence to other persons, etc., etc. We know that this is not true, but I also found very significant and disturbing expressions of racism in the debate. A Canadian book called The Black Candle talks about the, quote, Negro drug peddlers and, quote, Chinese opium dealers and, quote, fishy blood that are out of control. A year after this book, The Black Candle, was released, Canada outlawed cannabis. And I raise this because we should know some of the origins of this debate and about the sentiments that have permeated this debate for close to 100 years with its overriding stereotypes about the users and consumers of cannabis. These stereotypes continue to dominate much of the perception and the discussion, even though government commission after government commission here in Canada and around the world have debunked these myths. And in fact, our former colleague, Senator Pierre-Claude Nolan, in his 2002 report pointed out early drug legislation was largely based on a moral panic, racist sentiment, and a notorious absence of debate. So in the 95 years since cannabis has been outlawed, what has been the impact? And I quote from Ken McQueen, who wrote in Maclean's magazine, "This is a Canadian law that has succeeded in criminalizing successive generations, clogging the courts, wasting taxpayer resources, enriching gangsters, while failing to dampen demand for a plant that by all objective measures is far more benign than alcohol or tobacco." Honourable Senators, today in 2018, we're on the brink of legalizing cannabis consumption. It is fair then, I think, to examine and compare the impact of two different approaches, one which criminalizes cannabis possession and the other which takes a health prevention approach. And I've thought about this as a transaction, and the first part, in my mind at least, is the most basic part, which is buying of cannabis. According to stakeholders, excluding medical users because they have their own regime, most recreational consumers of cannabis will approach a dealer. And most likely, that dealer is in some way or another connected to organized crime, since organized crime controls all of the recreational market in Canada, estimated at about $8 billion. So you call your dealer, you meet with them, and they present you with a product. They may give you an option, one or two. I really don't know, but I have talked to people who do know this. There is no label on it. It doesn't have information about the THC levels. It doesn't have information about the CBD levels. It doesn't have information about what its outcome could be. Will it help you sleep? Will it give you energy? Will it help you relax? Is it laced with something else? None of this information is present in the current transaction. Under a legal and regulated system, that transaction stands to be transformed. Under the proposed regime, the adult buying the cannabis would go to a store or online system and have access to a bunch of information that was absent before. They have information on THC levels, they have information on potency, they can trust that it's not laced with anything, they know what the combination will do, sleep, relax, energy, etc. I think this is an important point that may have been overlooked. A person under this proposed regime would have a lot more information on what they are buying and consuming. They are now an informed consumer that can make rational and healthier choices for themselves, and that is the true essence of a public health approach, which is completely different from the current system of prohibition. I was in California last week, where it is legalized, and I took some time to go to a retail outlet. In Monterey, it was located in a very busy intersection in a mainstream kind of neighborhood. And as I entered, I wasn't alone, I was a little nervous, I took someone with me. There were 3 stages of security. I was first checked at the gate and frisked by security guards for weapons or something like that. I was then asked to produce my ID. I gave my Canadian driver's license. It was photocopied. And then they gave me a voucher that enabled me to enter the store. At the store entrance, I was checked again. The voucher was checked again for validation. The facility inside the store was actually quite unremarkable, but as I looked at the products, I noted that they were marked with so much 18% THC and CBD, etc. And if I had a question, as I did have, there were consumer service representatives who were able to answer that question. There were cameras all around, and what I found very interesting were the customers. They were not young adults. They were mostly middle-aged men and women. And by the way, this was not a crowd of people. There was a single line that operated quite efficiently. The second comparison I would like to make is on the current suppliers of recreational cannabis, which is organized crime, the use of violence, intimidation, and exploitation that ultimately jeopardize our communities and our country. They don't care what they are selling. They don't care about the health of their customer. They don't care about their age, and they only care about profit. So let's compare. In one system, organized crime has total control. In the other, legitimate producers, such as Canopy Growth, which I visited, supply regulated cannabis and provide, by the way, real jobs to communities. Under a legal system, organized crime is undercut. We're already seeing that in the US, in those states that have legalized cannabis. Colorado's government has said that licensed sales now meet 70% of the total estimated demand, with the balance of 30% being in the gray market of homegrown cannabis and sales. The third aspect I wanted to note, to compare, was the criminalization of simple possession of cannabis. Honorable senators, since cannabis has been illegal for close to 100 years, we know that thousands of Canadians have been impacted by this law. However, despite prohibition and an increase in criminal penalties under the previous government, use by all segments of the population has been steady. As a result, the numbers of people who are being criminalized has increased. And a look at the people who have been criminalized leads to a well-grounded conclusion that racialized and Indigenous communities are overrepresented in the system. And I want to bring your attention now in particular to the Black community. In my home city of Toronto, between 2003 and 2013, Toronto police arrested Black people at 3 times the rate of white people for minor cannabis possession. This despite data that shows similar rates of cannabis use among different racial groups. Professor Owusu Bemba from the University of Toronto has concluded that the enforcement of prohibition has therefore disproportionately affected racialized communities and has so led to a disproportionately high rates of African Canadians being incarcerated. In a general way, colleagues, I think we can all understand the impact of incarceration on our lives, in the lives of our families and our communities. But in a particular way, we need to appreciate and understand the intersections of race, socioeconomic factors, and incarceration. After being charged or convicted for an offense, African Canadians are left more or less exiled from full participation in society, as gainful employment becomes even harder for them to get because of the other systemic barriers. This is because of the disruption, arrest, and incarceration create in a person's educational trajectory, because in many cases scholarships are not able to be accessed, jobs are not able to be accessed because employers and prospective employers often ask for criminal records even when the job does not involve engaging with vulnerable populations. And depending on your social economic status and your capacity to lawyer up, there are lasting impacts. And lawyer Anthony Morgan describes it, I think, best when he concludes, the war on drugs has traumatized and destroyed African Canadian lives and families, and by extension, the whole African Canadian community. And although I highlight the African Canadian community in particular, I would also say that anyone charged with possessing cannabis over the years has faced significant hurdles throughout their lives. And of particular note, of course, is the high rate of criminalization versus the high rate of criminalization on Indigenous youth, who account for 37% of provincial territorial custody admissions, which is 5 times higher than their share of youth demographics. Fourth, I would like to touch on an issue that has been touched on many times, so I will keep it somewhat brief, and it is the issue of youth and young adults' use of cannabis and the impacts on the developing brain. And we have heard that the brain continues to develop until a young person is 25, and that cannabis can have an impact on that developing brain. And we also know that Canadian youth in particular are using cannabis at high rates compared to other developed nations. I think it is hard for us to project and to read the tea leaves of what will happen, but I think we have to take a look at what the evidence tells us. And the evidence from the south of the border shows that liberalized laws to cannabis do not lead to dramatic increases in use of cannabis by young people. And I will cite the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, where use of cannabis in Colorado dropped for young people from age 12 to 17 from 11% to 9%. And there is a slight uptick for use in ages 18 to 25. In Washington state, in a survey completed by 230,000 students, it was found that youth in grades 8, 10, and 12, their cannabis use remained unchanged over the past 10 years. So I agree with those who say if you take marijuana out of the hands of drug dealers and put the sales behind the counters, as I saw in Monterey, where it's sold under regulation and enforcement, then you are much more likely to get asked for an ID. When it comes to the effects of cannabis on the developing brain, I will simply say that I share the concerns that have been expressed, and I look forward to having these concerns addressed at committee. I will cite, as Senator Hartling did, Professor Jenna Valeriani at the BC Centre for Substance Abuse and Professor Rebecca Haynes-Saw at the University of Calgary, who stated that firm conclusions that cannabis by itself is explicitly damaging to the developing brain are difficult to assess. So finally, I think all of this is linked to education. Education is of the most importance when dealing with cannabis. Young people, adults, older people need to understand the impact if they consider using it. And I'll just remind all of us that at some point, we've all been young and we've all been attracted. Some of you will argue that you still are young, but the allure of the unknown, the forbidden, has an attraction all of its own. And I remember my first visit to Canada as a tourist in 1974, when at a gathering in Yorkville today.
Time is up. Is it agreed, honourable senators, 5 more minutes?
I don't need 5 minutes, just a couple more. I was offered a toke in Yorkville, and I was frankly really surprised by the numbers of people who were openly partaking of a forbidden substance. And I was too bound by my upbringing to be anything but totally horrified at the thought. Now fast forward some 40 years later. I give my mother her prescription for medical cannabis to help her with her pain from scoliosis of the spine. It is education that has helped patients like my mother consider and benefit from its use. It is education that helps me as a caregiver administer it to her and monitor it. It is education, I believe, in the same way that will help recreational consumers to be responsible for their actions and be aware of the dangers. So, honourable senators, I support this bill in principle. I support it because the current approach is not working. Many lives have been destroyed by prohibition that has permeated this issue for close to 100 years. It is time for a new approach. Thank you very much.
Do you have a question, Senator Dean?
The senator would take a question, yes.
Yes,
Senator
of course.
Omidvar, you'd take a question?
Of course, yes, thank you.
Senator Dean.
Thank you, Your Honour. Senator Omidvar, thank you for those remarks. They, I'm sure, have been heard by all of us here, and I know we will all be concerned about the impact of prohibition and criminalisation on racialised and Indigenous young people, and also those ills that you have described emerging from Canada's illicit market. Here's my question. I have seen references in correspondence over the last months and in this place to the option of decriminalising cannabis as opposed to legalising it and strictly regulating it. I wonder if you've thought about this option, and particularly in light of your examination of the nature of Canada's illicit market.
Senator Omidvar.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Senator Dean. So if we decriminalize cannabis, I think we're only addressing the criminalization of consumption, and we're leaving the entire supply and production still in organized hands. I think that is something we have to think about. If we want to bring cannabis out of the alley, out of the shadow, then legalization is the way to go. And I was on the brink of it until I visited this retail outlet in Monterey. As I said, I mean, I was checked 3 times. There were cameras around. There was pretty strict regulation. And I think about the pros and cons, and I think in the end, if we want to contain it, we must go this route because the other system has not worked.
Senator Bernard, do you have a question?
No, but honourable senators, I ask for leave of the Senate to revert to notices of motion.
Go right ahead, Senator.
One question in the time remaining. So, Senator Omidvar, regarding the, coming out of the shadows, taking the source out of, the illegal market, I'm just wondering about the parallels of the industry that we already have legalized, which is cigarettes, and the fact that the contraband market has been increasing steadily. And today I met with an expert who has studied this, and for example, in Quebec, it has increased to 60 to 80% of the market. So the illegal market exists with cigarettes, and I don't understand how we expect that it will not exist with the marijuana market when we already know that this infrastructure of the illegal market exists with contraband cigarettes, and that has been a big fight. So,
There's 39 seconds
okay,
left.
so anyways, I'd like to ask you whether, how can we not worry about the illegal marijuana market?
In 39 seconds or less, I will say, I think an illegal market can only be addressed through legal measures, such as regulation and enforcement. I also know human nature. I just as there are, and Senator Down keeps our feet to the fire on tax evasions, whenever there is a law, there is some abuse.
Senator Omidvar, I'm sorry, your time's